Professor Patti Hunter has taught at Westmont since 2000. She was honored as Teacher of the Year in 2007. She has directed Westmont in Mexico in 2009. She is the assistant provost. She enjoys watching Agatha Christie movies, which I've never seen even one yet. What's wrong? My wife loves them. And she plays tennis, she reads, she believes strongly in the positive effects of chocolate on mathematical cognition. And I asked her if that was really true, and it's a bit of an article of faith, but I agree. I do believe in the effects, the positive effects of chocolate. But anyway, Patti, we've been wanting you to speak for a long time. Some things happened last time she was scheduled. We won't go into that, but we're glad you're here, and let's welcome Dr. Patti Hunter.
Thanks, Ben. Good morning. Welcome back. 2 weeks left. Who's counting? I want to thank Ben for inviting me to speak in chapel today. It's an honor. It's a bit of a risk, though, Ben, putting a mathematician up here. Hope it pays off. So I want to talk to you this morning about 3 things. I want to share a little bit about my faith journey, and I also want to talk about the book of Numbers and mathematical axioms. Really. So let's start with axioms. These are the building blocks of our mathematical world. Axioms are the foundational assumptions about the mathematical objects of the particular discipline, like calculus or algebra or geometry that we're working in. They are assumptions that can't be proven, but that strike everyone as fundamentally true. When we recite creeds like the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed, or sing songs like that last one that we sang, which is based on those creeds, we are proclaiming the axioms of the Christian faith. Now, by far, the most famous mathematical axiom of all time is Euclid's fifth postulate. Postulate's just another word for axiom. It appears as the last in the axioms that frame a textbook from the 4th century BC called Euclid's Elements. Now, you've all read some version of this 2,000-year-old book. The geometry you learned in high school about congruent triangles and the Pythagorean theorem, bisecting angles, that all comes from Euclid's Elements. And Euclid's fifth postulate, this famous axiom, is actually something you all know and believe. It can be stated in several different ways, but the simplest is illustrated with this diagram. You have a line and you have a point, not on the line. Now, before I tell you what the axiom says, I'm going to make you do a little bit of thinking for yourself. So I want you to turn to your neighbor, and I want you to talk about this question. How many different lines are there that go through that point that are parallel to the given line? How many different lines can you draw? Okay, talk amongst yourselves. Okay, I'm pretty confident that you're all agreeing with each other. There's probably not a lot of debate going on. I'm pretty confident that most of you said the same thing. I'm pretty confident that most of you said there's only one line through that point that's parallel to the given line. There's only one line, right? Any other line that you would draw through that point is eventually going to intersect the given line. Well, that's Euclid's fifth postulate. Now, the axiom seems obvious, right? But you can't prove it. Actually, that's true for all mathematical axioms. It's a quality of axioms. They seem fundamentally true, but you can't prove them. If you think you have an axiom, but it turns out that you can prove it from your other axioms, then you throw it out of the axioms, you make it a theorem. It's not one of your assumptions at all. It's a consequence of your other assumptions. That's Euclid's fifth postulate, though. Okay, enough of that. Now, actually, mathematicians don't get up in the morning and think to themselves, I wonder what set of axioms I should start with today. Actually, we don't start with axioms at all. You don't get axioms settled for a particular discipline until that discipline is pretty established and mature. The initial ideas of calculus, for example, were created in the late 1600s, but it wasn't until the 19th century the mathematicians were able to write down a complete set of clear definitions and axioms that accounted in a logical, rigorous way for all the theorems and tools of calculus they had been using for the previous 200 years. So writing down axioms is less a matter of deciding what to start building your mathematical structure on, and more like taking it apart brick by brick and digging down to the foundation to find out what's actually underneath your reasoning. It's less about making a decision about what you want to base all your reasoning on, and more about examining your ideas and figuring out what foundational truths are already implicit in what you're doing. So one more thing about axioms, and then I'm going to move on. When you formulate a set of mathematical axioms for your mathematical world, you don't necessarily know where they're going to lead you. You can't see right away what all their implications will be. So as we move on, I want you to remember these three things about axioms. First, they're foundational truths that we usually accept as seeming obvious, but we can't prove them. Second, even though they're foundational, in our experience, our thinking and understanding doesn't usually start with axioms. They usually become clear and explicit to us after we've been living implicitly with them for a while. And third, the implications of our axioms aren't all clear immediately. So I did promise that I'd share something about my faith journey. And as nerdy as this is going to sound, it has been something like figuring out an axiomatic system. I didn't grow up in a Christian home, but sometime in junior high, I started going to church with my family. At that point, we were a pretty happy, functional family, but we weren't Christians, and my mom had decided that something was missing in her life. My mom's here today, which is fun. A friend had taken her to a Bible study, and she was exploring Christianity. And she was taking my brother and me, and sometimes my father, along with her. Over time, I gradually began to absorb some of the truths of the Christian faith. And as I first encountered the ideas, they didn't strike me as particularly revolutionary or as particularly problematic, and they didn't really have a revolutionary impact on my life, at least not initially. Maybe you know people who have had very dramatic conversion experiences. They were living lives of complete rebellion against God, and somehow He gets a hold of them, and they are radically transformed from a life of drug addiction, or rescued from a dark, despairing situation of abuse, or loneliness, or meaninglessness. Those are really exciting stories about God's redemptive power. But that's not my story. My life before meeting Jesus wasn't like that. I was a pretty good kid. I was a responsible student. I was reasonably respectful to my parents. My unkindness to my younger brother Tom was in the normal range of sibling unpleasantness. He might not agree with that claim. I was content to hang around decent kids who weren't particularly interested in drugs or alcohol, or if they were, they didn't feel a need to pressure me into joining them. My parents had a good marriage. They supported and encouraged me. I certainly wasn't perfect. Life wasn't perfect, but it was fine. I was fine. But as I said, we started going to church. I began to read the Bible, and gradually I began to absorb some of the truths of the Christian faith. And I began to build some of my choices in my life, some of my understanding of my place in the world on those truths. But those truths were always sort of implicit to me, in the background. Until one day, I was sitting at the kitchen counter by myself. I picked up a half sheet of yellow paper that my mother had brought home from the Bible study she was attending. It was a tract explaining the gospel. It explained that God was a perfect, holy being who loved us, but that our sin had separated us from Him. Jesus had died on the cross to take the punishment for our sin, and if we accepted his gift of forgiveness and committed our lives to him, we would have our relationship to God restored, and we'd go to heaven when we died. The tract went on to provide an example of a prayer one could pray in order to accept the gift and surrender to Jesus. All this seemed perfectly sensible to me, like Euclid's fifth postulate. It seemed obviously true. So sitting there at the kitchen counter, I prayed the prayer and gave my life to Jesus. That moment at the kitchen counter made something explicit that I'd been living by implicitly for a while. And the implications of this axiom for my life, the theorems that would follow from it, weren't immediately obvious. Remember, I said it can take a long time before you see where your axioms are going to lead you. And you don't necessarily go in a straight line from your axioms to their implications. When I was in college, I was going to be a high school math teacher. And my senior year, the movie Stand and Deliver came out. Anybody seen that movie? You should see it. It's the story of Jaime Escalante, a teacher in East LA who took a group of underachieving kids and successfully brought them through the AP calculus exam. The movie was inspiring, and I decided I was going to become a teacher in the inner city and change the world. The summer after college, I went on an Emmaus road trip to South Africa. This was before the end of apartheid, a horrible and oppressive policy of racial segregation and state-sponsored brutality of whites against blacks. We stayed with families in a black township and worked with a church on community reconciliation for a month. I came home from that trip determined to go back. I could teach math in this impoverished township and work for justice and reconciliation. Well, that's not what happened. My axioms didn't lead me there. I went to graduate school, I got married, had 2 kids, lived in the suburbs of Chicago for a while, and then I came to teach at Westmont. What happened? Did something go wrong? Did I throw out my fifth postulate and change my axiomatic system? No, I don't think so. I've lived my life trying to be faithful to what God has called me to, and those axioms had other consequences for me. In graduate school, after leaving the fairly sheltered, homogeneous, wonderful world of Westmont, I met a lot of Christians who didn't think exactly as I did about my faith, and I learned a lot from them. I met lots of non-Christians and had some opportunities, sometimes scary, to share what I believed about Jesus with them. I joined a church that had a style of worship that was new to me and some theological positions that challenged some of the ideas I'd been taking for granted. When Dave and I finished graduate school, we moved to Chicago to be close to his family, who didn't know any other Christians besides us. Again, we had to do the hard work of settling into a church community that wasn't exactly what we were used to. We had neighbors that we tried to share the gospel with. Here in Santa Barbara, we've raised 2 kids. We've worked with people on Santa Barbara's east side who face racial discrimination and economic challenges that are much more challenging than ours. We've made meals for families in homeless shelters and taught Sunday school at our church and befriended international students at UCSB. And we've taught math to some of you. So my axioms haven't always led me where I thought I would go. But the gospel and my relationship with Jesus have been the foundational truths from which God has worked in my life. I've been a Christian for almost 40 years, and I'm sure that seems like a long time to some of you, but it truly does take a long time, a lifetime, to work your way through the implications of that gospel axiom. So if you're a Christian, whether you've been one for a few weeks or months or years or a decade or maybe your whole life, I want to encourage you to take a long view of your life of faith. So think for a moment about the future. How old will you be in 40 years? This is probably a question for the students in the room. What implications of the fundamental truth of the gospel will have unfolded for you 40 years from now, by the time you're 58 or 62? What are you going to do over the next 40 years to make space for God to work out those implications in your life? I'll give you just 2 suggestions. First, be involved in a church. And second, find people you can share the gospel with who don't know Jesus. It's in these 2 experiences, the church and sharing my faith, that I have seen the most fruit come from that gospel axiom in my life. Neither are always easy. I have moved a lot since college, and finding a new church is hard. No church is perfect. Hardly any church is as good as the one you left behind. But in the church, week after week, hearing the Bible taught, worshiping and taking communion alongside other Christians, I am reminded of God's faithfulness and of my commitment to my axioms. And sharing the gospel with others has a similar effect. I definitely don't find it easy to share my faith with non-Christians. I'm not one of those people who can sit down on an airplane and start evangelizing my seatmate. I don't do that. But I have found that if I let myself get to know people, and if I start to reveal something of how the gospel has shaped my life, then it becomes impossible to avoid talking about Jesus eventually. And that sharing keeps my eyes open to the way God is working. And God is working. My 40 years of being a Christian have been shaped not so much by my choice to believe the gospel axiom, but by God's faithful working out of the implications. The book of Numbers is about God's faithfulness. Had you forgotten I was going to try to work that in? How could I resist? And this is what I want to end with. Numbers tells the story of the Israelites' 40 years of wandering in the wilderness after leaving Egypt and before they entered the Promised Land. They're wandering because they have repeatedly failed to trust in God's faithfulness. They complain about the food. They fret that there's no water. They rebel against Moses and Aaron. But their most egregious failure happens when Moses sends the 12 spies to check out the Promised Land. If you haven't read the book lately, you might remember these stories from your VeggieTales days. Moses sends out the spies, and they come back, describing it as this amazing land, full of abundant produce, flowing with milk and honey. But 10 of them stir up fear among the people, reporting that the current occupants are giants, far too powerful for the Israelites to defeat. And in spite of the pleas of Caleb and Moses, the Israelites panic, and they refuse to go in. As a consequence of this rebellion, God tells them that they are going to wander in the wilderness until the whole generation of adults has died. So we read this story and we think, what is wrong with these people? They had this extraordinary experience of God parting the Red Sea. They had the covenant between God and Abraham. Why aren't they living out the implications of those axioms? Ultimately, the amazing thing about this story isn't the Israelites' failure, but God's faithfulness. One of my favorite stories in the book is about the prophet Balaam. An enemy of Israel, the king of Moab, has seen the Israelites defeat some of the neighboring kings, and he knows that they're coming after him next. So he calls this prophet Balaam to come and put a curse on the Israelites. And then Balaam has this kind of crazy experience with an angel that tries to stop him, and his donkey starts talking to him. Eventually he makes his way to the king, but in the end he can't curse the people. Much to the king's anger, Balaam stands on a mountain looking out over the Israelites, and he says this in chapter 23. God is not a man that he should lie, or a son of man that he should change his mind. Has he said and will he not do it? Or has he spoken, and will he not fulfill it? Behold, I received a command to bless. He has blessed, and I cannot revoke it. God's blessing on his people is axiomatic. Its implications follow them through the wilderness and ultimately into the promised land. God doesn't give up on the Israelites in spite of their rebellions. He doesn't lie. He doesn't change his mind. His blessing on his people can't be revoked. When we believe the gospel and start on the journey of basing our lives on those axioms, God's faithfulness follows us, and there's no revoking his blessing. I want us to close our time together by singing another blessing from the book of Numbers. I'm going to read it first, and then Michael Schossberger is going to come up and lead us in singing it, and that can be our benediction. Numbers 6:22 says this, "The Lord said to Moses, 'Tell Aaron and his sons, this is how you are to bless the Israelites. Say to them, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. So they will put my name on the Israelites, and I will bless them.'"